appointed, invited, vetted to be part of the inaugural mental health task force by the NCAA that took place last November. And Dr. Brian Hainline, who's the first chief medical officer of the NCAA, he was appointed 1 year ago. He discerned that mental health is an under-recognized issue, and that's part of why he wanted to bring together a mental health task force to begin to get after what clearly is a very significant, persistent, ongoing issue for student athletes. So he asked me if I would make a short presentation on the student athlete with a history of sexual abuse. And what I did, I generalized that to people with histories of physical abuse. There certainly are distinct differences in terms of kind of clinical presentations and manifestations later in life, but there's more similarities to people with abuse histories than differences in terms of interference with young adult or adult functioning. I have an expertise in working with unconscious process in psychotherapy, thus I apply that to my model of working with individuals. So here we go. Wait, which one do I push? Oh. Here we go. Okay, so what we have with our student athletes is the obvious, meaning this is a young man who's clearly in some emotional distress after either a practice or a game. But then there's what lies underneath, and often less than conscious underlying areas of loss or sadness compound the intensity of the athletic experience for the individual. The individual experiences their frustrations or disappointment as greater than the reality of what's transpired. Exterior of our student athletes belies the psychological fragility that can be present. Individuals with histories of abuse often lack the emotional resilience to cope with the ordinary vicissitudes, meaning ups and downs of college life, let alone the extraordinary demands of student athletes. So as a result, I've coined the term running on empty. That individuals with histories of abuse utilize psychological energy less efficiently, so then depletion can occur more rapidly, and this is, of course, when psychiatric symptoms present. And I use the term running on empty. I like using metaphor and kind of the metaphor analogy to a really well-functioning body working. It's kind of like a car that's a fabulous car that works well, but if the car's out of gas, it's not going to go. And it doesn't matter how beautifully put together or constructed that car is, it's not going to go. And that's part of what happens to our student athletes when they run out of psychological energy. They no longer have gas to make their lives go. And so then that's when psychiatric symptoms present. Just like with a car without a gas, you turn the key, it's going to make weird noises. It doesn't even sound like a car. So people don't even look like themselves. All right, so individuals with a history of sexual, physical, emotional abuse can also suffer from PTSD. And PTSD is a diagnostic category that has its own particular identifying factors. And the demands of college athletics create an arena that are ripe with triggers for the affected student. So one of the characteristics of individuals who have a history of sexual, emotional, or physical abuse is they have an extraordinary sensitivity to boundary violations or perceived boundary violations. And that's an important distinction to make because oftentimes an insignificant encounter, either a physical one or an emotional one, is kind of nothing to us, but it's experienced as the individual as hugely intrusive. So again, a seemingly benign exchange can provoke a flood of affect with debilitating results for the individual. And then we have the less than benign exchanges which have to do with the impact of coaches' behavior. And of course, these are pictures of coaches who are in games, and they're wound up, and who knows what they're saying or what they aren't saying. But what I do know, and I think this isn't a hard conclusion to come to, is that the power and the potency of the coaching relationship is enormous. And the coach has so much decision-making power over the student-athlete. And, of course, athletes are there wanting to play. They want to play. They want to participate. The coach is the one in charge. And so the impact of coaches' behavior, even with coaches who aren't abusive per se, it is disproportionately greater than the impact of what someone else might say, like a trainer or even an assistant coach. And our student athletes get hurt by things coaches say and by things coaches do. And it's just, it may not be the most important relationship that a student athlete has, but I believe it's the most potent. It's the most powerful. So then as a result, and this is often what I see, and it is very much at times related to coaches or what happens in practice, more practice because that's the day-to-day grind and a game, but it's all kind of becomes part of one, is that gets in their head. And then kids with abuse histories, then it triggers memories of times when perhaps they were treated that way before that they're not thinking about consciously, but then that starts compounding what's going on with them in terms of the coach. And so what they can do is experience increased frustration. This can involve a distortion in thinking, where pretty soon they start having unrealistic performance expectations, start having self-deprecating statements to themselves, like in terms of, oh, I'm no good, I'm not good enough, if only this, then that. I'll tell you the number of times I have said to kids when I start hearing the if this, then that, it's like, I don't want to hear any if this, then that. It's like it just is entirely unuseful. So then coaching feedback can exacerbate and intensify this arousal that's already going on with the student, which causes further emotional decompensation, meaning the spiraling down and down in their despair. So then what starts setting in for any of us who've experienced depression or anxiety, we start feeling, we can feel worthless, we start feeling helpless, and then pretty soon at some point the person starts feeling hopeless. Hopeless about their situation, hopeless maybe even about themselves. And then as a result of that, images of failure come up. And for student athletes who are so much in the spotlight, and I've worked only with Division I athletes, they're highly in the spotlight, but I think it doesn't matter what division you're at. You're someone that has been successful, you've gotten attention, people are paying attention to what you do. So then there are many feelings of embarrassment, or self-loathing, meaning I hate myself, and then shame. Another experience of people with abuse histories is the experience of inappropriate guilt. And the way I like to help people understand the experience of inappropriate guilt, I would say, so what metaphoric crime did you commit? Because the problem with guilt is that it does imply that you've done something wrong. It's a legal term, guilty of crime. Okay, so oftentimes you hear people, maybe even you hear yourself saying this, oh, I feel guilty that I didn't do that, or I feel guilty that I blew this. Well, you might feel bad or disappointed that you didn't make that play, or that this didn't quite go your way, or that the outcome wasn't what you hoped. But that's different than that you did something wrong, because guilt implies that you committed a crime for which you should be punished. So not only does it imply you've done something wrong, whereas, you made a mistake, but you need to be punished for it. And so the problem with guilt in your head is the punishment piece. So you can't get out of it. So then it just hammers and hammers and hammers away. And part of why abuse victims are quite vulnerable to experiencing inappropriate guilt is that their abusers have been quite masterful at making them feel responsible for why the abuse happened to them in the first place. And so they're very well groomed to have this kind of complication. Another psychiatric symptom that can occur are somatic complaints, and this is where the symptom is split off from the origin of distress, meaning that the person feels it in their body. But oftentimes there isn't a medical origin at some point. Then another sign is what I call anxiety in disguise, and this is, a lot of times I get referrals for individuals who are having performance struggles of some sort. And so they don't necessarily know they're anxious or get depressed, but it's really what I call anxiety in disguise. And so it can involve where psychomotor agitation's involved, and that an example of that could be balking, like with a gymnast balking before they're doing their event, or a pitcher can balk, hitting a hurdle, cramping, tight muscles. Those can all be anxiety related. More disguises of anxiety, which involve psychomotor retardation, inability to pass a fitness test, missing balls, shots, fumbling. These all could be have underlying psychiatric symptoms going on. So we know that our student athletes are exceptionally vulnerable to losses in physical functioning, which remove them from athletic activity. And post-injury depression is really quite common. There's post-injury adjustment, and then that can then become a depression that needs attention. So, an injury or incident can derail a student, causing a psychological freefall. And as a result of kind of the combination of all the things I talked about, it can result in suicidal ideation, attempts, and other forms of self-harm. One of the warning signs, which we heard about earlier in the talk about substances, is reckless behavior. Reckless behavior certainly does involve substances, but it also can involve careless sexual activity, aggression, fighting. And again, we've heard great presentations about substances, but it's a way to regulate emotional life, at least in the short term. And I put in a picture about eating disorders because 30% of individuals diagnosed with eating disorders do have a history of abuse. So they're quite a vulnerable population to developing eating disorders. So, what do we have? To coin Emmett's term, we have a perfect storm, which is pressure-packed circumstances, clearly designated authority with power, namely the coach, students with volatile histories, and then, of course, compromised regulatory capacity. And so, again, this is part of the presentation I put together for the Mental Health Task Force, and that's what this is in there for. But it's also true for us, too, which is that we're here to put pieces of the puzzle together. I'm a big proponent of prevention, early intervention, programming and access to mental health services using an integrated model. And then we've heard this before, but I think it cannot be underscored enough. We need to work on the stigma. We need to rebel against the cultural stigma of mental health. Emotional life is crucial to well-being. Understanding our emotions, acknowledging when life becomes difficult is a tremendous step of courage. It is not weakness. When our athletes address the emotional obstacles interfering with functioning, they're then free to engage fully in relationship with themselves and with their sport. So that's what I have for today. I don't know if people have thoughts or questions. Yes?
What was the impact of the surgeons when you were to be a part of that mental health program for the visual woman? What was the
Well, my experience has been at Oregon State University, and I work for Samaritan Mental Health, which is an outpatient mental health clinic that's part of a bigger facility. And Oregon State has contracted for my services for 15 years. And I've worked in greater capacity there, lesser capacity. It sort of waxed and waned depending on really administrative issues, kind of when you're in someone's favor, when you aren't. I mean, the politics of athletic departments are probably well known to people. And currently, I see student athletes at my office, but there were times when I was over at the university for years in different capacities, but now it's back in the office. Other thoughts or questions?
So yeah, I wanted to ask, when you look at, in particular, the situation in your State University, maybe the situation at Ohio State,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, or just maybe the isolated situation where you see the coach sort of being very firm with a player on the sideline. What is there a line that coaches or administrators or they cross over?
I think there is a line, and I think there has to be a line, but of course this is quite subjective, and in many ways the culture of athletics is like the military culture. And all kinds of stuff gets said in military culture that within the confines of that is considered acceptable and in fact warranted or wanted to help prepare the individual who's in the military to do their job. And I think in lots of ways that's how abusive behavior is rationalized. Well, this is going to help them get tougher. This is going to help them, endure the kinds of challenges. And so I think that's the problem with part of why we don't have a line. It's just been so commonly accepted. And I think, as you know, in the last few years, it's coming out more and more and more. And what we need, which we're starting to get, but we need student athletes to speak out against it. To just say, no, this hurt me, this was not okay. And in fact, I suffered because of this, and this. But that's a tough thing to do. It's a tough thing to do. And part of a dilemma I face as a treatment provider is when my kids are actually still in the circumstance. And unfortunately, it's not quite like when you're seeing kids who are in an abusive family where you actually have some rights to do something about it. You don't. Mm-hmm. So it's tricky. Yes?
I'm just wondering if you've had any experiences with that we could kind of use as best practices in terms of coaches that are able to help student athletes prepare for those difficult situations on the playing field, but in a more positive way. I mean, have you seen examples of that, or are there any suggestions that you would make in terms of how we help coaches prepare students, as you mentioned, for the challenges they're going to feel or experience on the field in ways that don't cross that line?
Well, it's a good question. I think that'd be a good question to ask student athletes. But kind of off the top of my head, and this is my own value system, which isn't to say I think it's wrong, but I think being tough or raising one's voice or yelling, there's all kinds of ways that we can inspire people by getting revved up ourselves and getting jacked up. So I think in terms of those kinds of things, I think there can be parameters around which that's acceptable. What I find fundamentally unacceptable in sports and in life is when people are mean. I just have no use for meaning. I don't think it's helpful to anyone. I think it's destructive. And to me, if there'd be a way to have a best practice be about, hey, you can say whatever you want to motivate or to do this or to do that, but you cannot be mean to someone. You cannot demean someone. Name calling is not useful. I think it's destructive. So that's just sort of how I think about it. But that would be a good question. I mean, if at any point football teams or basketball teams or athletic teams were open to someone coming in and asking the student athletes, that would be a good question. Other thoughts?